No, it kind of happened overnight.
It did happen overnight. Well, congratulations.
It was about 10 years in the making.
Some careers follow a straight path, others zigzag wildly between triumph and disaster. Rick James lived one of the strangest journeys in music history. He went AWOL from the Navy, formed a band with Neil Young, spent a decade struggling in obscurity, became the king of punk funk, partied with everyone from Prince to Salvador Dali, and eventually saw his empire crumble under the weight of addiction and violence. When he died in 2004, he left behind hit records, Grammy Awards, and a trail of chaos that nobody could have predicted. This is the bizarre career of Rick James, from Buffalo to the Navy. James Ambrose Johnson Jr. was born on February 1st, 1948, in Buffalo, New York. His childhood was rough from the start. When he was 10 years old, his father, an auto worker, walked out on the family. His mother, Mabel, suddenly had 8 children to raise on her own, with no financial support. She did whatever it took to keep food on the table. She had trained and worked as a professional dancer for the legendary Katherine Dunham's dance company, one of the most prestigious black dance troupes in America. But dancing didn't pay enough to support 8 kids. She cleaned houses during the day, and to make ends meet, she ran numbers for an Italian crime family in Buffalo. Rick would later say his mother raised them as strict Catholics, a small, elegant woman of great dignity and strength who always had 2 jobs and never complained. Money was always tight. The Johnson family lived in the kind of neighborhood where you learned to be tough or you didn't survive. Rick watched his mother work herself to exhaustion. He saw how hard she fought to keep the family together. It left a lasting impression. Growing up in Buffalo in the 1950s and early 1960s meant living in a segregated city where opportunities for black families were severely limited. The city had good-paying factory jobs, but many of them weren't available to black workers. The neighborhoods were divided along racial lines. Rick grew up seeing those divisions every day. He found his escape in music. He had natural talent and started playing in local bands as a teenager, learning bass, guitar, and even drums in jazz groups. Music was the one place where he felt free. But by 15, he was also getting into trouble with the law. He racked up convictions for burglary, theft, and other petty crimes. The local authorities knew his name. Facing the possibility of being drafted into the army for Vietnam, Rick made a decision. In 1964, he enlisted in the Naval Reserve, thinking he could control his military service by choosing the Navy. It didn't work out that way. He was supposed to report for weekend training sessions twice a month, but music kept getting in the way. He'd miss sessions to play gigs. Pretty soon, the Navy wasn't asking anymore. They were ordering him to active duty in Vietnam. Rick didn't want to go. So in 1964, at age 16, he made a choice that would change his life. He bought a one-way ticket to Toronto and went AWOL.
They would love to see me in that situation. They seem to make you just to break you.
The Mynah Birds and Neil Young. Toronto, in the mid-1960s, had a thriving music scene. Yorkville was Canada's answer to Greenwich Village, full of coffee houses, clubs, and aspiring musicians. When Rick arrived, he was a fugitive. He needed a new identity. A local singer named Shirley Matthews took pity on him. She suggested he use the name of her deceased cousin, Ricky Matthews. Sometimes he went by Ricky James Matthews. For the next few years, that's who he was. Shortly after arriving in Toronto, Rick had a dangerous encounter. 3 drunk Americans confronted him outside a club, calling him a draft dodger and hurling racial slurs. They were about to beat him when a group of Canadian musicians intervened. Those musicians turned out to be Levon Helm and Garth Hudson, members of Levon and the Hawks, who would later become legendary as the band. Rick threw himself into the Toronto scene. He formed a group called the Mynah Birds, named as a play on the birds. The band mixed rock, soul, R&B, and even some folk influences. They wore black leather jackets and yellow turtlenecks. Their shows were electrifying. Then came the fateful meeting. A struggling folk singer named Neil Young was carrying his guitar and an amp down Yorkville Avenue when he ran into Bruce Palmer, the Mynah Birds bass player. Palmer invited Young to join the band. It seemed like an odd fit, adding a folk guitarist to an R&B group. But somehow it worked. The Mynah Birds with Rick James on vocals and Neil Young on guitar created something special. During their shows, Neil would play a harmonica solo, throw the harmonica high in the air, and Rick would catch it mid-performance and continue the solo. They had chemistry and showmanship. In 1966, the band signed with Motown Records, becoming one of the first mostly white acts the label had ever signed. They recorded 16 songs in Detroit, including tracks co-written by Rick and Neil. The single It's My Time was ready for release. An album was in the works. Then everything fell apart. The band's manager, Morley Shellman, mishandled their advance money. The Mynah Birds fired him. In retaliation, Shellman called the FBI and reported that Rick James was AWOL from the Navy. Rick was arrested during a recording session in Detroit. Neil Young and Bruce Palmer, who later admitted they thought Rick was Canadian, were shocked. Motown shelved the album. The Mynah Birds were finished. Rick was taken into custody and spent several months in naval prison. Neil Young and Bruce Palmer got in Neil's hearse and drove to Los Angeles. There, they would form Buffalo Springfield and write For What It's Worth, one of the defining songs of the 1960s. Neil would go on to join Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young and become a rock legend. Rick served his time. When he was released, he returned to music, but his big break wouldn't come for more than a decade. The long road to success. After his Navy troubles were resolved, Rick spent years trying to make it in music. He moved back and forth between Buffalo, Toronto, and California. He was in his 20s, talented, ambitious, but couldn't catch a break. The Mynah Birds experience had taught him he could create something special, but it also showed him how quickly it could all disappear.
I was angry about a lot of things. I was angry my mother had to work 2 or 3 jobs to support us, and I was angry at all those things. But it's fine to be angry and to be bitter. It's another thing to change those things around.
He moved to California and crashed on friends' couches, always hustling, always networking. For a while, he stayed with Stephen Stills, who was riding high with Crosby, Stills, and Nash. When Stills was putting together the supergroup, there was serious debate about whether to bring in Rick or another bassist, Greg Reeves. Rick lobbied hard for the position. He wanted to be part of something big again. But David Crosby and Graham Nash had concerns. They chose Reeves over Rick. Stills felt terrible about it. According to Rick's autobiography, Stills handed him a vial of pharmaceutical cocaine as an apology, a gesture that was both generous and destructive, given Rick's developing relationship with drugs. Rick watched as his friends and former bandmates achieved success. Neil Young was becoming a rock icon. The guys from the Mynah Birds were moving forward, and Rick was still grinding, still waiting for his moment. He worked as a songwriter and producer for Motown in the early 1970s. He had connections from his Mynah Birds days. He produced Bobby Taylor's Tailor-Made Soul album. He wrote songs for other artists. He was talented enough to work in the industry, but he wanted to be the star, not the hired help. One of his early production jobs was supposed to be for Diana Ross in the late 1970s. Motown paired him with the superstar, and Rick was thrilled. But when he discovered he was only working on half an album, with another producer handling the rest, he walked away. He later said, "Funk that, I'm out of here." He wasn't going to be anyone's second choice anymore, but one of the songs he'd written for Diana became a foundation for another career. I'm a Sucker for Your Love was released in 1979 by a young white singer named Tina Marie. It became her first hit and opened her debut album, Wild and Peaceful. Rick had discovered Tina, mentored her, and produced her. Their professional and personal relationship would become one of the most important of his career. In 1977, he returned to Buffalo and formed the Stone City Band with local musicians he'd known for years. This was it. This was the sound he'd been searching for. The band combined funk, rock, and a raw, aggressive edge that Rick called punk funk. It was unapologetically sexual, rebellious, and unlike anything Motown was known for. The name Stone City was slang for a prison, reflecting the urban, streetwise attitude Rick wanted to project. The band rehearsed relentlessly. Rick knew he only had one shot at this. He was 29 years old. He'd been grinding for over a decade. This had to work. In 1978, Rick finally signed with Motown's Gordy imprint as a solo artist. His debut album, Come Get It, featured the singles You and I and Mary Jane. The latter was a thinly veiled ode to marijuana, which would become one of his recurring themes. Both songs became huge hits. You and I topped the R&B charts and reached the Pop Top 40. The album went gold. Rick James, at age 30, was finally a star. After 14 years of struggling, sleeping on couches, watching his friends succeed while he waited, his moment had arrived. The success continued with Fire It Up in 1979 and Bustin' Out of L7 the same year. which included the hit Bustin' Out. Rick was building momentum, breaking attendance records at arenas across the country and establishing himself as one of the biggest funk artists of the era. His concerts were explosive. He wore tight leather pants, braided his hair in cornrows, and commanded the stage with a sexuality and confidence that felt dangerous and exciting. His band was tight. His dancers were incredible. And Rick himself was a showman in the tradition of James Brown and Sly Stone, but with his own unique flavor. He mixed punk rock attitude with funk grooves, creating something that felt fresh and rebellious. But his competition was fierce. A young artist from Minneapolis named Prince was rising fast, and Rick felt Prince was copying his style. Both wore braids, both mixed rock and funk, both had sexually charged performances. The rivalry between them would simmer for years, sometimes friendly, sometimes bitter. Rick would later claim he influenced Prince, which Prince never acknowledged. The tension was real.
Because a lot of times I actually did drugs hoping to OD and hoping not to wake up.
Super Freak and Superstardom. In late 1980 and early 1981, Rick recorded what would become his masterpiece. Street Songs was a concept album that captured the gritty reality of street life in his hometown of Buffalo. It mixed funk, rock, disco, and new wave into something completely fresh. The album featured Give It To Me Baby, which became a #1 R&B hit. There was the duet Fire and Desire with Tina Marie, one of the most sensual ballads of the era. And then there was the track Rick threw together at the last minute. He called it Super Freak. Rick later said he wrote it as a joke, something white people could dance to. He put it together quickly, just a silly little lick that he expounded on. The song's original lyrics were even more explicit, but a radio DJ friend, Alonzo Miller, heard an early version and told Rick that stations would never play it. Rick toned it down. Super Freak was released in the summer of 1981. Despite some radio programmers being wary of the raunchy lyrics, the song exploded. It featured The Temptations on backing vocals. The bass line was absolutely infectious. The video was perfect for the MTV era, with Rick's larger-than-life personality and charismatic presence filling the screen. The song peaked at number 16 on the Billboard Hot 100 and sold over 1 million copies. It was nominated for Best Male Rock Vocal Performance at the 1982 Grammys. Street Songs sold more than 4 million copies worldwide and reached number 3 on the pop charts. Rick James was everywhere. He toured with Tina Marie and the Stone City Band to sold-out crowds. Between 1979 and 1985, there weren't many artists as popular and successful as him. He was the king of punk funk, and he lived the lifestyle to match. The wild years. Rick's success gave him access to a world of excess that would have destroyed lesser men. And eventually, it would nearly destroy him too. The money was rolling in. He bought a mansion in Buffalo and another in Los Angeles. He drove expensive cars. He wore custom leather outfits covered in studs and fringe. He surrounded himself with beautiful women and loyal friends who enabled every impulse. He admitted to spending $7,000 a week on cocaine for 5 years straight. That's over $1.8 million, and that's just what he admitted to. He used marijuana from his teens, got into cocaine in the early 1960s, and when crack arrived in the 1980s, he found it impossible to resist. The drug became his obsession, his reward, his escape, and ultimately, his prison. He'd stay up for days at a time, writing songs, recording, partying. Then he'd crash hard. Between 1979 and 1984, he was hospitalized several times for drug-related issues. Friends and band members watched him spiral, but didn't know how to stop him. He was Rick James. He did what he wanted. His personal life was a circus. He dated Linda Blair, star of The Exorcist, who had called him the world's sexiest man in an interview. When he read it, he tracked her down to prove it. They began a relationship that was as intense as you'd expect. He later wrote the song Cold-Blooded about her, saying she could freeze his blood. The relationship didn't last, but it added to his legend. He worked constantly during these years, channeling his manic energy into production work for other artists. He worked with Tina Marie, writing and producing her hits, including I'm a Sucker for Your Love, Behind the Groove, and Square Biz. Their partnership was both professional and romantic at times, though Tina remained intensely private about the details. What's clear is that Rick saw something special in her and helped her become a star. He created and produced the Mary Jane Girls, an all-female group that had hits like All Night Long and In My House. He wrote for The Temptations, helping revive their career with songs like Standing on the Top. He worked with comedian Eddie Murphy on the hit Party All the Time. He produced tracks for Smokey Robinson. His influence was everywhere in the early 1980s. Salvador Dali once sketched him on a dinner napkin at a party in New York. Rick was starstruck meeting the famous surrealist artist. He put the napkin carefully in his pocket to preserve it. Later that night, high and careless, he jumped into a pool fully clothed. The sketch was destroyed. It was the perfect metaphor for his life, destroying priceless things through recklessness. But the drugs were catching up. Between 1979 and 1984, he was hospitalized several times. In 1984, he collapsed and was found unconscious on a friend's floor. His mother died in 1991, sending him into an even deeper depression and heavier drug use. His album Glow in 1985 and an appearance on The A-Team marked the peak of his mainstream visibility. After that, album sales declined. His sound was becoming dated as new artists emerged. By 1989, his 11th album was released only in the UK as a promotional release. Warner Brothers dropped him.
Drugs were very problematic. Drugs were a serious problem at different points and times in my life. I think some of them even say it enhances their creativity, which I think is kind of funny.
You Can't Touch This. Then came 1990. MC Hammer released You Can't Touch This, a rap song built entirely around the bass line from Super Freak. The song became a massive hit, bigger than Super Freak had ever been. There was just one problem. Hammer hadn't given Rick James credit. Rick and his co-writer Alonzo Miller sued Hammer. They won. Rick was granted songwriting credit and royalties. You Can't Touch This won Best R&B Song at the 1991 Grammy Awards. Rick James finally got his Grammy, 13 years after Super Freak, for a song someone else recorded. He earned well over $1 million from the sample. It should have been a comeback moment. Instead, his life was falling apart. The dark side. On August 2nd, 1991, Rick James and his girlfriend Tanya Hijazi were arrested. The charges were horrifying. They had held a 24-year-old woman named Frances Alley hostage in Rick's home for up to 6 days. They tied her up, sexually assaulted her, and tortured her by burning her legs and abdomen with a hot crack cocaine pipe. Rick was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, aggravated mayhem, torture, forcible oral copulation, false imprisonment, and kidnapping. He faced a possible life sentence if convicted on all charges. While out on bail for that incident, Rick committed another crime. On November 3rd, 1992, while high on cocaine, he and Tanya met with music executive Mary Sauger at the St. James Club and Hotel in West Hollywood. What was supposed to be a business meeting turned into a nightmare. Sauger later testified that Rick and Tanya held her captive and beat her for 20 hours. During the trial, Sauger's left eye was swollen shut, and her right eye was nearly the same. At one point during her testimony, Rick dozed off in court and started snoring. The judge called a recess to allow him to revive himself. Tanya Hijazi pleaded guilty to assault with a deadly weapon and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Rick went to trial in 1993. The jury convicted him of assault and false imprisonment in the Sauger case. The jury hung 11-1 for guilty on the torture charges related to Frances Alley, but couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. He was cleared of the torture charge that could have sent him to prison for life. On October 8, 1993, Rick James was sentenced to 5 years in Folsom State Prison, the same facility made famous in Johnny Cash's song. He served 2 years before being released on parole in 1996. Mary Sauger won a civil suit against him for $2 million. The king of punk funk had fallen about as far as a person could fall.
I think they like the funk.
Attempted comeback. Rick was 48 years old when he got out of prison. His career was over. His health was failing. His reputation was destroyed. He tried to rebuild. In 1997, he released Urban Rhapsody, his first album since prison. He toured to promote it. But during a concert in 1998, he suffered a mild stroke. His health never fully recovered. That same year, he appeared on VH1's Behind the Music, discussing his life and career with unexpected honesty. The episode aired in early 1998 and gave viewers a glimpse of a man trying to come to terms with his demons. Rick married Tanya Hijazi on December 24, 1997, despite everything they'd been through together. They had a son named Tasman, but the marriage didn't last. They divorced in 2002. In his final years, Rick was working on his autobiography, The Confessions of Rick James, Memoirs of a Super Freak. He wanted to tell his own story, to have some control over how he was remembered. Then, in 2004, something unexpected happened. Dave Chappelle featured Rick James in a sketch on Chappelle's Show. Chappelle played Rick in an exaggerated, over-the-top way, delivering the now famous line, "I'm Rick James, B.E." The sketch introduced Rick James to a whole new generation who knew nothing about his music, but they knew the character Dave Chappelle created. Rick became a punchline. The sketch was funny, but it also reduced a complicated, talented, troubled man to a cartoon. The end. On August 6, 2004, Rick James was found dead in his home in Burbank, California. He was 56 years old. The cause of death was pulmonary failure and cardiac failure. The autopsy revealed 9 different drugs in his system. He had diabetes. He had a pacemaker. He'd survived a stroke and a heart attack. His body simply couldn't take anymore. His autobiography was published in 2007 by Colossus Books, 3 years after his death. But music journalist David Ritz, who had been hired by Rick to help write the book, felt the published version didn't reflect how Rick wanted to be portrayed. In 2014, Ritz published his own version, Glow, the autobiography of Rick James, to set the record straight. In November 2020, Rick's estate sold a 50% stake in his publishing and masters catalog to the Hypnosis Songs Fund for an undisclosed amount. In 2021, Showtime released a documentary about his life, Bitchin', The Sound and Fury of Rick James, directed by Sasha Jenkins. The film explored both his musical genius and his personal demons.
Because a lot of times I actually did drugs hoping to OD and hoping not to wake up.
The legacy. Rick James's career was bizarre because he was so many different things at once. He was a musical innovator who created punk funk and influenced everyone from Prince to the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He was a brilliant songwriter and producer who helped launch the careers of Tina Marie and others. He was a showman with charisma that could fill any stage. But he was also a deeply troubled man whose addictions and violent behavior hurt people and destroyed his own life. He spent $7,000 a week on drugs while claiming it didn't affect his music. He went from sharing a stage with Neil Young to serving time in Folsom Prison. Super Freak remains one of the most sampled songs in music history. It's been used by MC Hammer, Jay-Z, the Black Eyed Peas, and Nicki Minaj. It's played at weddings, sporting events, and parties. Most people who dance to it don't know anything else about Rick James. That's the tragedy. A man who created something that brought joy to millions ended up becoming famous for all the wrong reasons at the end of his life. The Chappelle sketch, as funny as it was, became how a generation remembered him. Rick James lived fast and hard. He said yes to everything, pushed every boundary, took every risk. He achieved massive success, experienced tremendous lows, and never found a middle ground. In 1982, when he was at the peak of his fame, he told People magazine, "You smoke a joint and write a song, and next thing you know, you've got a check in the mail." That casual confidence defined his approach to life. Music came easy to him when he was using, but the drugs that fueled his creativity also destroyed him. Looking back now, it's hard not to wonder what Rick James could have accomplished if he'd gotten clean earlier, if he'd avoided the violence, if he'd managed the incredible gift he had. But that's not who Rick James was. He was all or nothing. He was the super freak, for better and for worse. His bizarre career left us with unforgettable music, cautionary tales, and a reminder that talent alone isn't enough. You have to survive your own success. Rick James didn't. So that's the bizarre career of Rick James. From going AWOL in the Navy to forming a band with Neil Young. From a decade of struggle to becoming the king of punk funk, from Grammy Awards and sold-out shows to prison and obscurity, Rick's journey had more twists than anyone could have imagined. He gave us music that still moves people today, but he also showed us how excess and addiction can destroy even the brightest star. If you enjoyed learning about Rick James's incredible and tragic story, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the legends who shaped music history. And let us know in the comments, what's your favorite Rick James song? We'd love to hear from you.